in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
All of those systems can be a limiter for any one athlete, and multiple systems can be limiters. So when we talk about the respiratory system, it's important to remember that although we are married to the idea that respiratory training will help you as an athlete, we recognize that all of those other systems also need training and need attention and could be limiters in given people.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by Luke Way and Dr. Andrew Sellars, where we're going to talk about respiratory muscle training and the isocapnic Breatheway Better training system, which is a respiratory muscle training system that Luke and Andrew developed. Luke and Andrew, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me to this, Phil.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this sort of stuff because Andrew and I have had many long discussions offline about respiratory muscle training. I'm more of a skeletal muscle centric guy. So him and I, we have opinions on getting people better, and we have like where we focus. Mine is in the muscle, his is more the respiratory system. So I'm really excited to be able to dive into respiratory muscle training because this is a little bit more of a popular new sort of topic. And I really think that Luke and Andrew have a really cool product that people can try out. And we'll for sure go into that. So the first thing I want to do is start with introductions. Luke, why don't you start first? If you could give us your background, both athletic and academic, and then a brief introduction on how and why you decided to really target respiratory muscle training and come up with this company that you guys developed.
Yeah, nice. I'm Luke. I'm a chartered professional coach up here in Canada. I've done some work with the national team here, and I run a high performance training center here in Kelowna, where I help triathletes reach both professional potential and an Olympic pathway routes, which is awesome. My deeper background is I was a professional athlete beforehand. Went to school U of C, took psychology, and then I've been studying under Andrew Sellars for the last 20 years, getting as much knowledge from him as I possibly can. But that's my background.
Yeah. So what kind of drove you guys to really, or you specifically, Luke, to get into like this idea of respiratory muscle training and everything?
Yeah. Awesome. So I talked about Andrew as my mentor. Andrew developed under the guise of Jurg Feldman a type of testing procedure that sort of blew traditional lactate testing out of the water, made it a lot more repeatable, and was more based on finding physiological limitation versus just benchmarking different systems. Mm-hmm. And so he, taught me that years and years ago. And then over the last couple of decades, we have been developing a new type of test and constantly upgrading it to include more and more technology like VO2 Master and Moxie and core sensors and all that sort of stuff to dig deeper down that hole of objectively identifying limitation within athletes. In doing thousands of tests over the years, we've come to the realization that 70% of the people through the lab have a respiratory limitation. And so we've been constantly like digging up like reasons or how digging up ways of training that system specifically. Mm-hmm. And so we've used, products in the past like Spire Tiger and Aerofit and things like this to try to figure out, like, does it do what we need it to do? And some of them work, some of them don't work, some of them are prohibitively expensive. And that was really the sticking point. And for me personally, like, I train high performance triathletes. And if anybody knows anything about triathletes, they don't have $1,500 to $2,000 to spend on a breathing tool. And so, through that necessity came the invention of trying to produce a respiratory training device that was isocapnic, it controlled your CO2 levels, and it didn't cost an arm and a leg. And it's going to come with all the know-how and information you need to be successful with it. And so that's the journey we started on about, 2.5 years ago. And here we are sort of like a year and a bit into really selling the device. And we're at the 10-yard line of being able to launch our full-fledged app that
Awesome.
Really delivers on that promise of having the hardware from the Breatheway device, but then the software behind it to give you exactly what you need to do next, whether you're a noob, whether you have COPD or asthma, or whether you have anxiety, whatever your goals might be, it's going to lead you down to what you should be doing with the device and what you should be doing next to get better.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I think that's something that I have found in terms of, technology or releasing like a new hardware device doesn't just come with releasing the new hardware now. It's almost expected where you have to have the educational piece with all of that, at this in this day and age. And it's really it can be tough to get all that educational side of things, together. But I really respect the fact that, you guys you have the device, you have the software side of things with the app, which again, that's another big challenge. And then you also have the educational side of things. I was, Andrew, I think, or both of you guys sent me one a while ago. So I kind of got into the weeds with the respiratory muscle training. And I really liked, kind of just the straightforward nature of it. You're like, oh, here's the beginner workouts, and you treat it, just like you would any sort of workout. You follow, progressive overload, specificity, all that sort of stuff. And it can be pretty tough. The slow breathing especially was really, really challenging for me. So that's really cool. And I'm excited to dig into this. But before we do that, let's pass it off to Andrew. Andrew and I finally met in person, I think, at Kona last year, and we didn't stop talking probably the entire time we were there, unless we were sleeping. So Andrew is one of those types of people who has a very, very vast wealth of knowledge. And Luke, you kind of glazed over this, like, I think it was called balance point racing, right? Or like the balance point test that Jurg developed, and I think probably along with you and all of that. But there's some really, really cool tests out there that I don't think many people have heard of. A lot of it's just like, oh, just do a lactate step test, and then where you get to 2 millimole and 4 millimole, those are your thresholds, and we'll call it there. And I think that really is limiting to what we can actually use to diagnose not diagnose, but assess our athletes and all that. So Andrew, I'll stop talking. I'll let you give us an introduction of your athletic and academic background, and then I'm just interested to hear more about how you got to the point of this idea of like respiratory muscle training as well.
Yeah, it does go back actually to the early 90s when I first met Jurg, and he did become a huge influence in my life and really kind of changed the path for me. At the time, I was a professional swim coach. I was paying my way through university by coaching summer clubs in around BC, western part of Canada. And I met Jurg up in this small town in the middle of nowhere. And he was an incredible Swiss physiologist who had to move away from the hustle and bustle of Europe to open a goat farm in northern BC, but had his hands on some of the best athletes in the world, and was instrumental in creating some of the best mountain bikers in BC at the time. That was Jeff Kabush and Ryder Hedgestall. But he was also involved with a number of other endurance sports, and he just was this wealth of information that I was lucky enough to tap into just because of a coincidence of working in the same town as him. And he introduced me to respiratory training back then as a new device came on the market from a friend of his in Switzerland. And he brought it to me and said, what do you think about this device? And I started playing around with it, and I was like, there's no way it can do what it says it does. It had all these glorious claims. And I dug into the research a little bit. I reconnected with Jurg 10 years later when I was in medical school. And through medical school, I learned a lot more about physiology and especially the respiratory system. And the device started to make a little bit more sense. And we actually took it into the hospital, into the operating room, and I hooked it up to our anesthetic machines to see if I could test what it presumably did, which was maintain carbon dioxide levels in a normal range. And it actually was able to do that. And it had this remarkable system of being able to alarm when you were breathing too little and breathing too much, and it would keep you in this ideal range. And so we used that device. That was a Spirotiger, and we used that device for 15 years. And just about every athlete that I worked with. So after medical school, I went to my family practice residency. I did an anesthesia residency and started working. But I had this huge passion for physiology and coaching. And in working with Jurg again a few years later, he had developed the lactate test, which he called the Feldman and Klebeck test. Klebeck was his partner in crime, and so it's called the FACT test, and it was a lactate testing protocol that actually didn't look at absolute numbers, but looked at trends of lactate. And once you understand how lactate works in the body, you can quickly understand why absolute numbers don't make any sense.
We're going to have to talk about that on another podcast. Yeah.
So I had a bunch of young athletes who kept asking me for advice on their coaching, and I couldn't really sustain coaching and a career in medicine. So my wife and I originally started the Balance Point Racing team. And my wife coached a few athletes, and I helped some young athletes just to try and help them sort of along a pathway of development. And I met Luke, and Luke was living in Calgary at the time and racing with sort of aspirations of being a professional athlete. And he was just so keen to hear and learn more for his own journey. And my memory is that I kind of invited him. I said, if you ever want to come to the Okanagan and just train and learn and stuff, then come, because I need more people that can actually are interested in this, because I can't do it full time. And within a year, maybe 2 years, Luke moved out to the Okanagan and took over the Balance Point Racing team for me. And it's been a journey ever since there. And last weekend was a pretty big weekend for Luke as a coach. He supports Corey Wallace, who's a Kona sponsored athlete who just won his 5th 24-hour mountain bike world championship.
Awesome. Congrats,
Luke's
man.
been helping him since the beginning. So that was a huge success and something to celebrate. And the same weekend, his young athlete, Brock Hole, was racing at Pan Am Games and helped the Canadian teams to a bronze medal in their team relay. So it's just been a fantastic journey of watching young athletes develop and helping professional athletes do amazing things. And so the device, and Luke and I have just had this friendship for a long time. And Luke started saying, listen, can we do something different with breathing so we don't have to rely on a really expensive piece of equipment? Because I want everybody to use it, but it's just too expensive. And that's really how the idea of the Breatheway came. And Luke was fortunate enough to meet an engineering father of one of his coached athletes who also wanted to get into it. So the three of us started the business together. And I really am just in a supportive role for Luke and Alex as they trundle down the road of entrepreneurship and building a business. But it's been a super fun journey, and it's fun to see people getting better with their breathing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool. And I think, at least from like a research standpoint, like if you ask most researchers and people that teach, say like limiters to performance, like even in my exercise physiology classes, they'll tell you, oh, most likely it's the cardiovascular system that's really limiting at least oxygen, diffusion. And I think, this idea of respiratory muscle training and everything like that kind of goes a little bit in the face of that. So I guess my next question or my follow-up question would be, so you guys do, I take it, subscribe to some level of the limiter test, right? Like either 515 or, some other version that you guys have, probably a little bit more meticulously put together over time. But yeah, I think that let's start there. Let's say, okay, well, how first I want to answer the question, how are our respiratory muscles really involved in performance? And then how would we identify if somebody actually is respiratory limited? Because what I'm finding as well when I do 515 tests is that it's a significant proportion of people who actually do have pulmonary limitations versus just strictly this cardiovascular limitation that we've been taught in traditional exercise physiology. So let's start with the respiratory muscles, how they work, how they're involved in performance, and then we can go from there. Yeah,
so I'll take that one on. We could talk about this for hours because you're speaking my love language now.
Yeah.
So like you referred to the cardiovascular system as being a potential limiter, so is the respiratory system, but so are other systems. So you have the metabolic system that drives fuel sources to be able to create energy. You have the muscular system, which has to has to combine to coordinate actions and make strength and power moves. You have the coordination, the neurologic system that has to coordinate all those things, and you have the psychological system that actually has to monitor it and push the body beyond what normal activities would be. And all of those systems can be a limiter for any one athlete, and multiple systems can be limiters. So when we talk about the respiratory system, it's important to remember that although we are married to the idea that respiratory training will help you as an athlete, we recognize that all of those other systems also need training and need attention and could be limiters in given people. And the easiest example is someone who's had a heart attack or has congestive heart failure, has a bad heart. And it doesn't matter what you do to their respiratory system or their muscles. You can make them as strong, you can make them be able to bench press 300 pounds, but their limitation is always going to be that heart that doesn't work properly. Mm-hmm. And in any developing athlete, the challenge is trying to find out which system is actually limited at any one time. And once you train that system, you expect that it will be not a limiter anymore. And in that case, it'll shift to a different system. Mm-hmm. And so all of the testing we do at Balance Point Racing and all the testing that I recommend that coaches do when they test athletes is to look for those limitations. As opposed to doing typically what most tests were done in the lab was to see how good an athlete was and then grade them on a scale. And there's virtually no value to the athlete in that kind of testing. It's either done for research or it's done as a selection process. So no athlete benefits from being tested to just see how good they are. The best test for an athlete is to put them in a race or put them in a competition to see who wins. That's the only test that really matters. Now, if you're talking about health and wellness, then there's other tests that we want to do to eliminate disease or reduce the burden of aging and all those other things. When we talk about respiratory, when we talk about the respiratory system, there are muscles that drive the respiratory system, and the primary mover of the respiratory system is the diaphragm. So about 70% of the airflow that happens in and out of your lungs is responsible by a well-functioning diaphragm. Now that's in a healthy person who's got a diaphragm that works properly. Mm-hmm. All the other muscles are accessory to that to help drive the air both in and out. So you have the intercostal muscles, the muscles that go between the ribs. There's internal intercostals and external intercostals, and they're responsible for different parts of the breathing phases. You have the abdominal muscles. You have muscles in the neck called the accessory muscles that help rise the top part of the chest up and down. And all of those muscles are skeletal muscles that can be trained just like your biceps, just like your quadriceps. They are just muscles that can be bigger, they can be stronger, they can create more tensile strength, they can develop more endurance capacity, just like every other muscle that you can train in the gym or train by running or cycling and all those things. Mm-hmm. The lungs themselves are not trainable. They are just a sponge, and they're encapsulated in this tight on the inside of your chest wall, and they respond to those muscles as the muscles contract and expand the rib. It's an interesting dynamic. It's a really complex system that is basically, but the simplicity of it's just opening up a triangle and then reducing the triangle back down. And the bigger you can open that triangle, the bigger the lungs will stretch and the more air you can pull into them. And the more you can push it down and the more strength you have to complete the range of motion and have range of motion in your ribs, then you can actually squeeze that triangle tighter and you get more airflow. And that is what shifts the ability to move more air. So you're physically limited by how big your triangle is, and really that's a limitation of how tall you are. So the taller you are, the bigger the triangle and the more air you can move. And then you're secondarily limited by how much air of those, how big you can make that triangle with the contraction of your diaphragm and contraction of your external intercostals to expand the rib cage. And then the second part of the limitation, other than the structure of how big your triangle is and how big you can make it, is how fast you can move it and under what kind of conditions you can move it faster and more coordinated. And so there are a number of different limitations that we can pull out by watching people breathe. And it is helpful to have devices like you mentioned earlier, like VO2 Master, to be able to actually see respiratory patterns and see at what point during a graded exercise test, which is what most people, most coaches and most trainers would use to sort of determine performance is start really easy and get harder and harder and harder. And you watch how those respiratory patterns change as people breathe harder and harder and harder. Mm-hmm. And so then we look at, is it a volume limitation? Is it a coordination limitation? Is it a power limitation? I'm missing one.
Endurance, power.
Yeah. And endurance. Yeah. So you can see people fatiguing their respiratory muscles, and that leads to dysfunctions in how they breathe. And so a good coach, and this is fascinating to watch. If you have coaches that have spent a lot of time standing on a track watching people go around, they can actually see when their athletes start to lose form. And if you're measuring their breathing at the same time, you can almost always, before they lose their running form, they lose their breathing coordination. Mm-hmm. And so I had I'll just dive into one story really quickly. I had this fascinating experience of trying to help a short track speed skating coach when I was doing some work up in Yellowknife. And he invited me. He knew that I was doing a bunch of testing with athletes and things. He said, can you come help my athletes? And I said, I know nothing about speed skating. And he said, I just want you to tell me what you see when you watch them skate, and maybe you can have some insights into their physiology. So I happened to have at the time a first generation, it was called a bioharness, and it could send data wirelessly to a computer and on someone's breathing patterns. And so it was just on an elastic stretch. So the more it stretched, the bigger the lungs, and it was quite unique. It was a great little tool. And I was watching them go around in circles, and so I had 3 athletes all being tested at the same time. And one of them was breathing 60 breaths a minute. And I'm like, that athlete, there's no way that athlete can keep breathing like that and keep skating.
Right.
And so I pulled the coach over. I said, that athlete is going to fail very soon. They were just doing a warm up. And he said, no, that's the best skater we have. I go, she cannot keep skating like that for more than a minute. And sure enough, about 30 seconds into this, she's skating around in circles. She stands up and she coasts a lap, and her breathing slows down to 30 breaths a minute. I can watch her. I'm just watching her breathe. And then she starts getting back into the group again and starts warming up, and her breathing automatically jumps up to 60 breaths a minute. And I said, does she have to stop every 2 minutes when she's doing warm up? He goes, yeah, but she's just stretching out her legs. I'm like, nope, she's just recovering her breathing. And he said, and I could show him every time she was going to stand up, because anytime she tapped over 60 breaths a minute, she'd stand up again. Mm-hmm. And it was such a simple demonstration for the best skater in his club that didn't have the endurance or the coordination to be able to breathe deep enough and slow enough to maintain her oxygen levels and her CO2 levels at a stable level. And then as soon as she lost control of that, she couldn't skate anymore. It became a super simple intervention. We taught her how to breathe, trained her how to breathe, and then she could sustain for as long as she wanted. And she did become one of the best skaters in Canada. And it's not surprising. She was a great athlete. She just didn't know how to breathe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really valuable point, is that, a lot of people, especially, so I come from a running background, and nobody teaches you how to run. They just say, oh, go out and run. Then you get into high school and stuff like that, and you see people with, like the weirdest, like gaits and cadences and stuff like that, holding their arms all weird and doing all this sort of stuff. And, so that's one thing, right? You could have a coach come in, teach you, do a gait analysis, teach you how to actually have proper form, because then you're going to be more economical and all of that. You train your cardiovascular system, like your cardiac system, right? By doing VO2 max intervals and doing other things like that. So, there's not any, like your heart is controlled, essentially all autonomically, but so just by training, you're going to make that better. You're going to train your muscles by doing, proper, distribution of easy and hard intensity and stuff like that. But nobody's telling you, oh, breathing actually matters, except maybe like the basketball coach you have in, in like 6th grade, who's just like, oh, don't put your hands on your knees, blah, 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 blah. Open up, you got to stand up and open up your diaphragm, something like that. Right. But that's about the extent of it. And, so I think that because of that, because people don't get taught really how to breathe, that then enters, that gives you guys a good niche to try to get more people to breathe better. And then on top of that, then they're like, oh my gosh, like my performance is actually better. Exactly like what you're saying with the, that speed skater, right? She had to stand up every 2 minutes, but after you guys, fixed her or, taught her how to breathe, she became one of the best in the country. So Luke, do you have any, kind of like, stories or anecdotes about that as well? I'm sure you do.
Yeah. So what I'm chomping at the bit to talk about is like, so Andrew, I love the way Andrew talks about it. Very like, matter of fact about the system, has this range of motion and has this coordination level and blah, 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 blah. When like one of the primary things, like break it down into like this, like every part of your body has, a range of motion. And the difference between like my finger, right, and like your diaphragm is, if I'm going to challenge my finger's range of motion, I'm going to start at one end and I'm going to go until it's closed and I'm going to cycle through that range of motion. Your respiratory system is way different than that. It has a range of motion, yes, but it's being used hopefully 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of your life, right? And it's not being used in this range of motion. It's being used in this range of motion, right in the middle, small, little, metabolically cheap way of breathing, which is cool. But that also like builds a level of fitness and conditioning through this small range of motion. And so what we see, especially as athletes get into their mid to late 20s, into the 30s and beyond, that diaphragm and intercostal muscles start to stiffen up. And so we start to lose that total range of motion, not forever. If you were to condition it with something like a Breatheway or respiratory training, you could actually start to like gain some of that range of motion back. But it's not just as easy as like, oh, just take a deep breath. Like chances are your diaphragm, one, hasn't been conditioned there. So let's give you 6 breaths nice and deep, and then they're fatigued, and then you're done for the day. Or you've actually like stiffened your ability to move your intercostal muscles and move your diaphragm in a way that actually lets you take advantage of how much total space you have. And so, yeah, it does require training. It does require conditioning in that way. And one of my favorite things that Andrew taught me years ago is the body will always do whatever's easiest. Right. So if you don't condition your respiratory system and you always push yourself till you're at 60 breaths per minute and then you fail, then you're going to get really good at breathing shallow and small until you fail, and then you rest and then you repeat. And so if we were to actually train that into a way where you're able to move bigger, deeper breaths, let's say that 60 breaths per minute is 150 liters per minute. Instead of meeting that with 60 breaths per minute, you can do it with 20 breaths per minute, but just increase your total volume. And then there's a whole rabbit hole of how that cycles through that dead space, way less. That I'll let Andrew dig into the dead space at some point through this conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot of really good points there, Luke, like with anything. And what's amazing to me for all these conversations that I have on the podcast is that it's like what comes back time and time again is this, like the simple rules, not simple, but like the rules of adaptation. You have to have specificity, consistency, and progression over time. And, if you just pointed it out, if your diaphragm is only moving, so I don't know what the actual range of motion for like a diaphragm would be. Let's say it's moving an inch, whole range of motion is 6 inches. If it's generally only moving an inch, you can't expect to then just be like, oh, well, I heard that, deep nasal breathing is going to help me increase my, my expansion of my lungs. You can't just expect that to be an efficient movement the first time you do it, because, your muscle has made those adaptations to only be effective at that small range of motion. So you have to practice it, right? And not only that, you have to practice the going in, but you also have to, practice the forceful contraction of going out, because that's gonna press. If we're thinking you were doing a triangle, and the only thing I could really think of is like those old like things to keep the wood on your wood fired stove, like
that's exactly how the diaphragm works. You create negative pressure, it sucks air in. You create positive pressure, it pushes air back out. It is a bellows. It's exactly like a bellows, and the diaphragm is the bottom of the bellows. The interesting thing what you just commented about the normal range of motion is just for an average 5'8" gentleman, his lung volumes are going to be somewhere between 5 and 6 liters. the typical range of motion and the typical volumes when he's resting is about 500 mils. So most people only use about 10% of their lungs when they're resting breathing. Mm-hmm. The reason that your resting pattern goes through taking deep breaths every once in a while because it doesn't like only using 10%, and it tries every once in a while to take a deeper breath. And you'll see us, if you just watch people sitting on the bus, they take these tiny little breaths, you can hardly see them moving, and then every once in a while they'll just sit up a little bit and take a full breath, and then they'll breathe it back out, and then they'll go back into their normal patterns. That's totally normal breathing patterns.
Is that similar to yawning?
It's similar to yawning. The process of yawn is a deeper, more pronounced version of that. But everybody does a internal yawn without the open mouth at least once a minute or once every 2 minutes as part of opening up alveoli in the lungs. And it's just a triggered response from the body to say it's not healthy to continue breathing small breaths all the time. Mm-hmm. But the other part that you mentioned was about the muscles, and for people to understand, is it truly a limitation to muscles? And the original studies were all done, we're just looking at that. Like, what happens if people's respiratory systems gets tired? And so the original studies were super simple. They just put people on a time trial. They just did a time trial on a bike, 20 minutes all out. And then they tested their breathing before the time trial, and they tested their breathing after the time trial. And after the time trial, they couldn't breathe as hard or as fast or as strong as they could before. And that makes sense. I'm tired. Like, okay, mm-hmm. What happens if we do the reverse? What happens if we make them breathe really hard and really fast before the time trial? Mm-hmm. And not surprising to us, their time trial sucked. So you can fatigue this respiratory system so much that they actually can't do the performance that you wanted them to do. And that skating girl in Yellowknife would have been super simple. You just make her breathe really, really hard before she starts her warm up, and she goes, "I can't even skate anymore." Yeah. And that very simple study is really all you should need to understand to go, okay, so if we train the respiratory system, we should be able to eliminate that difference between what happens when it gets tired and how long it gets tired. And that really is the focus of all respiratory muscle training and respiratory endurance training that followed after those original studies from the mid 80s and early 90s. We're talking about 35 years ago now. Like, this is not new research or new literature. This is old stuff that has been proven through dozens of studies, and now it is how do we make it better? And there are a bunch of devices that are on the market, but ours is one of the few that actually you can use for endurance training as well as muscle training.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just as a quick side tangent, so this idea that your respiratory muscles actually, can limit performance. And Andrew, you can expand on this. I would love if you expanded on this, but it's called the respiratory metaboreflex. So essentially, when your respiratory muscles start to get fatigued, just like any muscle gets fatigued, you start to, release more. Metabolic byproducts. Those metabolic byproducts then can increase sympathetic activation and other things like that. And in the case of respiratory metaboreflex, it actually shunts blood going to your external, your legs and your arms, which are important for locomotion, and tries to bring more blood to your breathing muscles. And in that case, it's a protective mechanism from you passing out, essentially, but at the hindrance of your ability to perform. Because if you're limiting oxygenated blood going to your muscles, then you're just simply not going to be able to make enough energy to keep that exercise intensity going. But it's because your body doesn't want to die, from suffocating to death.
Yeah, I think your description of the metaboreflex is really good. I think that was good. I'll add one other little piece of information to that, is that the respiratory muscles can use up to 15 to 20% of the total cardiac output. Wow. So if you're and that's a sustainable levels of exercise. You can actually go up higher than that, depending on the individual, when you get toward maximal efforts. So of all the blood pumping out of the heart and all the oxygen being provided to the muscles, 20% could be going to the respiratory system. Mm-hmm. So you're only getting 80% into your working muscles at the best of times. If you have a poorly functioning respiratory system and you drive more flow to the respiratory system, you have less of that energy going to the muscles. And like you've said it before, where oxygen is really a measure of energy. So if you're not getting oxygen to the muscles, you're not getting energy to the muscles, you cannot actually produce forward motion. So any limitation to what you're sending to the muscles, to the peripheral muscles, is going to limit performance. And so what we're trying to do with respiratory training is minimize the demands on the respiratory system by making it more efficient. So even a 5% reduction, improvement in efficiency of the respiratory system will lead to a 5% increase in efficiency of the muscular system just by giving it more fuel to burn.
Mm-hmm.
And that really is the fundamental basis of what we're trying to do, is limit the metaboreflex to stop the body from going into conservation mode and save the respiratory system over top of what we're trying to do, which is run faster or swim faster or bike further.
Well, it's funny. Like it's always, I find it funny how it's surprising to these sports medical practitioners that I have audience with from time to time. Just the other day, I was in front of 20 practitioners, and we're talking about the theory behind respiratory muscle training, and they're all like nodding, yes, CO2 is important and oxygen is important, blah blah blah. But then you give them a ramp test with the Breatheway, and they start off at 15 breaths per minute, and it slowly gets harder, over the span of 5 minutes. It's a 5-minute long set. It's a typical warm up that I'll give an athlete. And it goes up to about 45 breaths per minute. And so it's really only the last minute and a half that's actually quote unquote hard, like arduous breathing, over 100 liters per minute type thing. After 5 minutes, they pull it out, they're sweating, they're like, oh my God, that was really hard. And they've been doing nothing but sitting on their bums watching the metronome.
Yeah, it's like breathing.
And then you have to cue in that whole set was 5 minutes, which is not that long. And the last little bit was actually hard. And it wasn't that hard. It was 45 breaths per minute where it ended. And so you put that in perspective of how people run a 10K or a marathon, right? They're breathing like that for a long duration. And so you can't tell me after you've felt that feeling of how hard your body has to work to breathe, that it doesn't rob you from performance if it's not efficient when you're trying to run on top of it. It's just it's so easy to demonstrate, and it's difficult to bridge that gap, even with these smart doctors, where I'm explaining the theory, and they're like, yes, of course. And it took for them putting this thing in their mouth and going through the protocol to be like, whoa, okay, that's what the theory means. Okay.
Breathing is hard. And that is, and like you said before, people don't connect that because most people aren't challenged. They've never been challenged with their breathing unless they've been running. So they think it's the running that's hard. And it might be. For some people, I'm a perfect example. I get sore muscles when I run. So my limitation is my calf muscles. I just can't run that far without my calves getting sore. Okay, but my limitation isn't breathing, because I can breathe that level for a long time. But until you actually isolate it and say, listen, try and breathe the way you would run, and just isolate the breathing, people do not realize how hard breathing is. Breathing is really hard.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. When I was first, getting acquainted with the Breatheway device, I, did one of those ramp tests, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can change my physiology so much just by breathing. And then if you start thinking about it, right, this is where, the wellness practitioners and stuff, they're like, well, if you're shallow breathing all the time, you might be inducing some anxiety. So breathing deeper and holding and doing other things like that, because, your breathing is hard, exactly like what you said. And then on top of that, you're going to change the sympathetic or the autonomic tone of your system, from there. And I've been playing around with this a little bit while I ride on my stationary trainer, doing things like zone 2 training and other things like that. And it's really interesting when I calm down my breathing, breathe deeper and more forcefully, my heart rate actually goes down. So if we're using heart rate as kind of our metric for internal physiological stress and strain, I can reduce, say I'm riding at 170 watts. Heart rate is normally 130. I can generally go from 130 to about 125. So I'm saving
There's two main physiological reasons for that. One is there is an internal circuit for stimulating cardiac dynamics,
Right.
and so some of it is the change in chemistry that's happening. But the main driver of that reduction of heart rate is actually the vagus nerve, which runs right through the diaphragm. So when you're taking deeper, more efficient breaths, you're actually stimulating the vagus nerve, which has a parasympathetic effect of slowing down the heart rate. And
also,
it's one of the biggest benefits of slower breathing is actually the parasympathetic effect.
The diaphragm's it's like the second heart.
Yeah, I was gonna say. So going off of that, right? Like they say, so when you open up that diaphragm and create, I guess it's lowering of the intrathoracic pressure, you're actually allowing for better, venous return. So you're filling up your heart longer, and then it can beat more effectively as well. So
exactly, those are the two main drivers of slowing the heart rate down by slower breathing, and so. Just one more comment that you made earlier, that if your limitation is cardiac, so if you actually have a cardiac limitation, you're actually much better off breathing slower at the same intensity. But if you can't breathe slower because of your respiratory system, then your respiratory system ends up being the limiter for your cardiac system.
Right.
So it's a fascinating way to unload the cardiac system by training the respiratory system.
Yeah,
so if
it's so fascinating.
Slower, deeper breaths, you can actually make it easier on your heart. And this is one of the benefits for cardiac patients that are post-op recovery or who have had issues with their heart, is you can make them more efficient at getting through their daily lives by tapping into that extra resource. I teach them just to slow their breathing down. It will make their lives better.
Yeah. Even like Andrew was called the feedback cycle between anxiety coming in, your brain freaks out, your brain then tells your heart to increase, and then your respiration increases, and that blows off CO2, which makes your brain freak out, which then tells your heart to freak out, and it creates this cycle, right? And so by teaching yourself to breathe deeper and slower and hold on to that CO2 a little bit longer, actually lowers the stress on the system, allows the system to calm down.
Yeah. It's the only subjective way you can actually shift anxiety is to slow your breathing down. Because as you mentioned, the heart is purely autonomic. So the heart only responds to whatever else the body and the brain are doing. So the only way you can stop a panic attack without having to lean on medications is to actually just slow your breathing down. And that will break, in every instance that it's been used, will break the cycle of a panic attack, is just by slowing your breathing down.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating, and we're kind of running out of time. So I'm gonna get you guys back on the show here at some point, because I think that these are very valuable conversations to have for people, and it's stuff that I don't really even know like that much about. But before I let you guys go, so we've kind of touched on the assessments before, but is there like a standard protocol in terms of assessments that you use to diagnose one of the 4 different types of, I guess, like what sort of pulmonary training you have to do? And then on top of that, how do you then transition that into a training plan? So with like the last 7 minutes or so that we have, let's talk about the testing and assessment. So I'll let you guys start with that, and then I'll ask the other question.
Yeah. So I'll before Andrew gets into the nitty gritty with it, I'll go with the really simple version of it, which is, if you're wondering if respiratory training is right for you, know that 70% of the athletes that come into our lab need it. Right? It's actually an identifiable limiter to their performance. That doesn't mean the other 30% can't benefit from it, but it does mean that 70% of them really need it as a training focus. So for everybody, it's a good chance that it's going to really be a good thing for you. The next level of assessing whether or not it's good for you is getting some spirometry done. And so you can get that done by your general practitioner, or go to a respiratory therapist, or any one of, look around your local area, and somebody's probably selling the ability to do spirometry. It's a very simple test that takes, 3 deep breaths to figure out how big your lungs are. And what we're looking for is 2 metrics. We're looking for how big your lungs are, the forced vital capacity, versus how much volume you can push out in 1 second. And so with that, we get a ratio of how strong you are by how much you breathe in the first second versus how big your total volume is. And so we get to see, like, diagnosable COPD is below 50%. And so if you can only get 48% out in the first second, then chances are you have some sort of constriction problem. And then the third, and I would say the best way to assess it, is to use something like VO2 Master to dig deep into how you're able to actually like utilize your respiratory system throughout a step test or throughout a 515 assessment, and get a really deep look at how your system copes with different stress loads and exactly how it fails. Does it fail because of endurance? Does it fail because of power? Does it fail because of coordination of range of motion, right? Does it fail because your gas exchange starts to get out of balance? And so that's sort of like the hierarchy of how you can sort of assess whether this is right for you. I don't know if Andrew can color that in.
No, I think that's
follow up, Luke. What if someone's FEV1 or forced vital capacity, so FEV1 to FVC, what's the ratio that you kind of be like, oh, that's like an acceptable range? Because you said COPD is like below 50%.
Yeah.
And what I've seen is like 0.75, 0.8.
Yeah.
Is that generally your guys' like metric that you use?
Yeah. So you're looking at primarily like that functional power, that ability to blow, 75 to 80% in the first second. And that's a good number. I would say that's bubble in the middle, top of the bell curve, good. An exceptionally good ratio would be like 90%. Right. That's what I would say is elite. But it's only part of the picture. The other piece of the puzzle is that total volume, right? If you're 6'6", tall, and you're breathing 90% in the first second, but your total volume is like 5.5 liters, then you're structurally limited to how much space you should have. And this is one of the tools that we're developing, is this ability to put in your spirometry numbers, and it'll tell you you're in this part of the bell curve for your power, but you're in this part of the bell curve for how big you are, right? Okay. And giving you like a really good indication that like you should be working on functional strength, or you should be working on endurance, or you should be working on your total range of motion, just coordinating range of motion. And that honestly is more often the case, is that we have reasonably okay ratios of how strong you are in the first second, but the total volume compared to what we've seen in people is way off.
Yeah. And
it's vastly trainable. Like, I have so many case studies that I can show you that have athletes coming in to see us at, 4.5, 5 liter lung capacities. And over the span of a year or two, we see them go 6, 7, 8, 9 liters of growth, right? It's very trainable, this system.
Yeah. And that's going to be built into the app in the sort of future iterations, is you'll be able to plug in your spirometry data and get some recommendations based on that. And you'll be able also to add other data as you collect it. Mm-hmm. For those that don't have access to VO2 testing or respiratory testing, you can do some very simple respiratory ideas. And really, it's just counting your breaths and just understanding. So I quite often do this with people who are where I'm helping them online, or they're just asking advice. And you can do a very simple 3-step test. You start walking, do an easy jog, and do a fast jog, and just get used to, how do you breathe when you walk? How do you breathe when you jog? And how do you breathe when you run? And even those as a basic understanding. And so when we talk about 45 breaths a minute is a pretty hard effort, and it's correlated pretty closely with a 10K running pace, because most people run somewhere between 85 and 95 RPM, and they'll pattern their breathing at a 2 and 2 pace. So they'll breathe 2 breaths in, two steps, they'll take a breath in, and 2 steps, they'll take a breath out, and they'll keep doing that repeatedly. And that comes down really closely between 44 and 46 breaths a minute. Mm-hmm. So unless you have a really high cadence up into the high 90s, and you'll end up pushing your respiratory rate up into the high 40s, or you have a really slow cadence. And fascinatingly enough, a lot of people with slow cadence, the reason they're running slow cadence is because they can't breathe 45 breaths a minute. As soon as you teach them how to coordinate breathing 45 breaths a minute, their cadence will increase and their running speed will increase. So again, another reason that breathing can be an effective performance is they're only running slowly because they can't move their feet faster because they're tying it to their breathing, which can't go any faster.
Yeah. That's this is all very, very interesting stuff, and I want to be respectful of both of your times today. So we'll hopefully be able to get you guys back on the show and dive a little bit deeper into truly what you guys want to do and your goals, for isocapnic and the Breatheway Better technology.
It's really simple for us. We just want to help all people breathe better. That's our mandate.
Yeah, that's a great mission statement. And you guys have definitely kind of tickled my interest again in doing more respiratory training and stuff like that. So maybe we could team up on a YouTube video or something like that, where we actually just go through the full protocol, show everybody what it's all about, and then I actually start practicing, because I certainly have pulmonary limitations when I run, and it seems to be a similar limitation when I cycle as well, but just to a smaller degree. So with that, I will we'll kind of wrap things up. As always, you can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. So if you have any questions and you can't find Andrew or Luke on Instagram, you can DM me and I'll forward the questions to them. If people want to get in touch with both of you guys, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, easiest is probably just on Instagram as well. Isocapnic, that's us. Or on the website, isocapnic.com.
Yep, check out their website as well. It's really cool. If you're interested in trying to get into this sort of stuff, want to read a little bit more about it, or just follow some of their beginner training plans. That's kind of what I was doing, when I first got the device and everything like that. Go to isocapnic.com, check things out. If you guys have any questions, like I said, let us know either in the comments down below or DM us, and we'll catch you guys in the next one.